Can evil be born, or is it made? This question has haunted philosophers, theologians, and criminologists for centuries. But in 1872, in a small American town whose name has been deliberately forgotten by history, this question would find its most chilling answer in the form of a child with eyes like polished marble. The autumn winds carried an unusual chill the night Edwin Grayson entered the world. The midwife who delivered him would later swear she had never seen anything like those eyes, not blue, not gray, but something in between, like stones pulled from a frozen riverbed. They were eyes that seemed to watch without blinking, to see without understanding mercy. From his very first breath, Edwin was different. While other infants cried with the desperate hunger for life, Edwin emerged silent, his marble gaze fixed on something beyond the dimly lit room. The doctor who attended the birth later told his wife he felt as though those tiny eyes were studying him, cataloging his every movement with an intelligence far too old for such a small form. As word spread through the town about the Graysons' newest addition, neighbors began to take notice during their visits. Mrs. Henderson from down the lane would later recall how Edwin, barely old enough to crawl, would fix those unsettling eyes on her and simply stare, not with the innocent curiosity of a child, but with something that made her skin crawl and her heart race. She stopped visiting altogether after finding him one afternoon, sitting motionless in his crib, surrounded by the broken remains of what had once been beautiful wooden toys. Toys that showed signs of deliberate, methodical destruction. Other children in the neighborhood seemed to sense something wrong as well. Even before Edwin could walk properly, they would give him a wide berth during family gatherings. Dogs would whimper and retreat when he approached. Cats would arch their backs and hiss at his presence. It was as if nature itself recognized something unnatural in the boy with the marble eyes. But if the outside world found Edwin disturbing, the atmosphere within the Grayson household was suffocating. The family's grand Victorian home, once the pride of the neighborhood with its intricate woodwork and stained glass windows, began to feel more like a prison than a sanctuary. The very walls seemed to absorb the tension that grew thicker with each passing day. Edwin's father, Jeremiah Grayson, was a man of strict religious conviction who ruled his household with an iron fist wrapped in biblical verse. Yet even his unwavering faith began to crack under the weight of what his youngest son represented. Jeremiah would spend hours locked in his study, poring over scripture, searching desperately for answers that seemed to slip through his fingers like sand. His wife, Margaret, had once been known for her gentle spirit and warm smile, but Edwin's presence in their home changed her. She became withdrawn, jumping at shadows, speaking in hushed whispers even when discussing mundane household matters. The servants noticed how she would cross herself whenever she had to tend to Edwin, how her hands would shake as she changed his clothes or fed him his meals. The Grayson family carried secrets that ran deeper than their neighbors could imagine. Whispers in the town spoke of Margaret's father, who had spent his final years in an asylum, raving about voices that commanded him to do unspeakable things. Others mentioned Jeremiah's brother, who had disappeared one winter night, leaving behind only a letter filled with cryptic warnings about the family's cursed bloodline. These dark threads of family history seemed to weave themselves into Edwin's very being. As he grew from infant to toddler, the household became a place where normal family life withered and died. His older siblings, Sarah, age 12, and Thomas, age 10, learned to navigate their home like soldiers crossing a minefield. They spoke in whispers, moved with careful precision, and never, ever looked their youngest brother directly in those marble eyes for too long. The house itself began to reflect the corruption within. Flowers in Margaret's once pristine garden would wilt and blacken overnight. The family's prized grandfather clock stopped working altogether, its hands frozen at midnight. Even the family Bible, a treasured heirloom passed down through generations, began to show strange discoloration on its pages, as if something dark and oily was seeping through the leather binding. Edwin's presence transformed their home from a place of love and warmth into something far more sinister, a house where fear lived in every corner, where love had rotted into something unrecognizable, and where a child's darkness seemed to feed hungrily on every hidden sin and whispered, shame. As Edwin grew into boyhood, his true nature began to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The first signs were subtle. Small creatures found dead in the garden, their tiny bodies arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural death. Field mice, songbirds, even the neighbor's prized tabby cat. All discovered lifeless, their eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. Edwin's games became the stuff of neighborhood legend. He had a peculiar fascination with broken things, not the act of breaking them, but the aftermath. He would spend hours examining shattered glass, running his small fingers along the jagged edges until they bled, his marble eyes reflecting a satisfaction that chilled anyone who witnessed it. He collected these broken objects in a wooden box beneath his bed, fragments of mirrors, pieces of china, the wings of dead butterflies. His siblings bore the brunt of his evolving cruelty. Sarah would be found in the morning with mysterious bruises on her arms, marks that formed perfect finger-shaped patterns. When questioned, she would only shake her head and whisper that she had fallen. Thomas developed a stutter that appeared, suddenly and without medical explanation, speaking only in fractured sentences when forced to interact with Edwin. The boy seemed to understand instinctively how to inflict maximum psychological damage with minimal physical evidence. He would whisper things to his siblings, predictions of terrible fates, descriptions of pain so vivid and detailed that they would wake screaming from nightmares for weeks afterward. Yet when confronted by his parents, Edwin would simply smile, that unsettling smile, and claim he was only playing games. His fascination with pain extended beyond his immediate family. During visits from relatives or neighbors, Edwin would find ways to test the limits of human endurance. An accidental spill of scalding tea on a guest's lap, a strategic placement of sharp objects where visiting children might step on them barefoot. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to appear coincidental, yet the pattern was unmistakable to those brave enough to see it. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed tones about the Grayson boy. Some claimed they had seen him talking to shadows in the cemetery, carrying on animated conversations with empty air. Others swore they had witnessed him standing motionless in the town square at midnight, his marble eyes reflecting the moonlight like beacons of malevolence. Mrs. Whitmore, the school marm who had briefly attempted to educate Edwin, would later recount how he had shown her a drawing he had made during penmanship practice. Instead of the simple sentences she had assigned, Edwin had filled his slate with detailed diagrams, anatomical sketches that no 7-year-old should have been capable of creating, much less understanding. When she asked him to explain his work, he had simply smiled and said he was drawing the insides of things that stopped moving. The whispers grew louder with each passing month. Edwin wasn't just troubled. He was something fundamentally wrong, something that shouldn't exist. In the natural order of things, parents began keeping their children indoors when Edwin was spotted on the streets. Shop owners would hastily close their doors when they saw those marble eyes approaching. Even the town's elderly residents, who had lived through wars and plagues, and all manner of human tragedy, crossed themselves when Edwin Grayson's name was mentioned. But whispers and crossed fingers would prove inadequate protection against what Edwin was becoming. As Edwin grew into boyhood, his true nature began to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed or explained away. The first signs were subtle. Small creatures found dead in the garden, their tiny bodies arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural death. Field mice, songbirds, even the neighbor's prized tabby cat, all discovered lifeless, their eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. But it wasn't just the deaths that unsettled the community. It was the artistry behind them. Edwin had developed what could only be called a signature. Each victim was positioned with deliberate care, their lifeless forms arranged in poses that seemed to tell a story of their final moments. A sparrow might be found with its wings spread wide as if frozen mid-flight. A field mouse would be discovered sitting upright, its tiny paws pressed together as if in prayer. These weren't random acts of childhood cruelty. They were calculated, displays of power and control. Edwin's games became the stuff of neighborhood legend. He had a peculiar fascination with broken things, not the act of breaking them, but the aftermath. He would spend hours examining shattered glass, running, his small fingers along the jagged edges until they bled, his marble eyes reflecting a satisfaction that chilled anyone who witnessed it. The blood seemed to fascinate him most of all, not the pain it represented, but the way it caught the light, the patterns it made as it dried, the metallic scent that lingered in the air long after the wounds had healed. He collected these, broken objects in a wooden box beneath his bed, fragments of mirrors that reflected distorted images, pieces of china that had once held family meals, the delicate wings of dead butterflies pinned to velvet boards. But his most prized possessions were the things he had broken himself, objects that had once brought joy to others, now reduced to sharp-edged memories of destruction. His siblings bore the brunt of his evolving cruelty, becoming unwilling, participants in experiments that grew more sophisticated with each passing month. Sarah would be found in the morning with mysterious bruises on her arms, marks that formed perfect finger-shaped patterns. The bruises appeared in places where they would be hidden by her clothing, suggesting a level of premeditation that was deeply disturbing in one so young. When questioned, she would only shake her head and whisper that she had fallen, her eyes darting nervously toward Edwin's room as if afraid he might be listening. Thomas developed a stutter that appeared suddenly and without medical explanation, speaking only in fractured sentences when forced to interact with Edwin. The family physician examined the boy thoroughly, but could find no physical cause for his speech impediment. What the doctor didn't know was that Edwin had been conducting what he called voice experiments on his older brother, forcing Thomas to repeat certain phrases while applying increasing amounts of pressure to sensitive areas of his throat and chest. The boy's stutter was his mind's way of protecting him from the memory of those sessions. The boy seemed to understand instinctively how to inflict maximum psychological damage with minimal physical evidence. He would whisper things to his siblings, predictions of terrible fates, descriptions of pain so vivid and detailed that they would wake screaming from nightmares for weeks afterward. His voice would take on an almost hypnotic quality during these sessions, dropping to barely audible levels that forced his victims to lean in close, making them complicit in their own torment. Edwin's whispered words seemed to plant seeds in his siblings' minds, dark thoughts that would grow and flourish in the fertile soil of their fear. He would describe in precise detail how their pets might die, how accidents might befall their friends, how their parents might abandon them if they discovered certain secrets. These weren't idle threats but carefully constructed psychological traps designed to isolate his victims and increase their dependence on his mercy. Yet when confronted by his parents, Edwin would simply smile that unsettling smile and claim he was only playing games. His ability to shift between predator and innocent child was perhaps his most terrifying trait. In the presence of adults, he could summon tears on command, adopt a trembling voice, and present himself as a confused and frightened little boy who didn't understand why everyone seemed afraid of him. His fascination with pain extended beyond his immediate family, reaching into the broader community with tendrils of malice that seemed to grow stronger with each successful manipulation. During visits from relatives or neighbors, Edwin would find ways to test the limits of human endurance. An accidental spill of scalding tea on a guest's lap, timed perfectly to occur when his parents were distracted. A strategic placement of sharp objects where visiting children might step on them barefoot, positioned with mathematical precision to cause maximum damage. Each incident was carefully orchestrated to appear coincidental, yet the pattern was unmistakable to those brave enough to see it. Edwin had developed an almost supernatural ability to predict human behavior, to anticipate exactly where people would step, what they would touch, how they would react to various stimuli. It was as if he could see invisible threads connecting cause and effect, allowing him to orchestrate pain from a distance while maintaining perfect deniability. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed tones about the Grayson boy, their conversations taking on an almost ritualistic quality. Some claimed they had seen him talking to shadows in the cemetery, carrying on animated conversations with empty air that seemed to respond to his words. Others swore they had witnessed him standing motionless in the town square at midnight, his marble eyes reflecting the moonlight like beacons of malevolence. as if he were broadcasting signals to forces beyond human understanding. Mrs. Whitmore, the schoolmarm who had briefly attempted to educate Edwin, would later recount how he had shown her a drawing he had made during penmanship practice. Instead of the simple sentences she had assigned, Edwin had filled his slate with detailed diagrams, anatomical sketches that no 7-year-old should have been capable of creating, much less understanding. The drawings showed internal organs with scientific accuracy, each structure labeled in Edwin's careful handwriting with notes about function and vulnerability. When she asked him to explain his work, he had simply smiled and said he was drawing the insides of things that stop moving. The casual way he delivered this explanation, combined with the clinical precision of his artwork, convinced Mrs. Whitmore that she was dealing with something far beyond her understanding or ability to help. The whispers grew louder with each passing month, spreading through the community like a contagion of fear and suspicion. Edwin wasn't just troubled, he was something fundamentally wrong, something that shouldn't exist in the natural order of things. Parents began keeping their children indoors when Edwin was spotted on the streets, recognizing instinctively that their normal protective measures were inadequate against whatever he represented. Shop owners would hastily close their doors when they saw those marble eyes approaching, their hands trembling as they turned keys in locks that had never been used during daylight hours. Even the town's elderly residents, who had lived through wars and plagues and all manner of human tragedy, crossed themselves when Edwin Grayson's name was mentioned, their weathered faces taking on expressions of profound unease. But whispers and crossed fingers would prove inadequate protection against what Edwin was becoming, and the community's growing fear would soon be justified in ways they could never have imagined. Every monster has a beginning, a moment when the line between darkness and action is finally crossed. For Edwin Grayson, that moment came on a rain-soaked Thursday in October when he was barely 9 years old. The storm that day seemed to mirror the tempest that had been building within the boy's marble-cold heart, as if nature itself was preparing to witness something that would forever alter the delicate balance between innocence and evil. The victim was Timothy Walsh, a boy of 7, who had made the fatal mistake of wandering too close to the old mill where Edwin often went to think. Timothy was small for his age, with bright red hair that caught the light like flame, and a spray of freckles across his nose that made him look even younger than his years. He had been searching for his family's escaped chicken, a plump hen named Gertrude, who had developed a habit of wandering beyond the boundaries of the Walsh property. The mill had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its great wheel frozen in place by rust and neglect. Local children had been warned to stay away from the structure, but Timothy was young enough to believe that rules applied to everyone except him. The building stood like a monument to forgotten industry, its weathered wooden walls bearing the scars of countless storms and seasons. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of decay and dampness, punctuated by the occasional drip of water through the deteriorating roof. Edwin had been using the mill as his private sanctuary for months, transforming it into something that reflected his inner landscape. He had arranged spaces within the building like rooms in a dollhouse, each area serving a specific purpose in his growing catalog of experiments. There was a corner where he kept his collection of bones, sorted by size and type with scientific precision. Another area housed glass containers filled with various specimens, insects preserved in different stages of decomposition, small organs extracted from his animal victims, even samples of hair and nail clippings taken from his siblings during their sleep. What happened in that mill would haunt the town for generations, becoming the stuff of nightmares that would be passed down through families like a cursed inheritance. Edwin had been expecting Timothy, not the boy specifically, but someone like him. He had learned to recognize the signs of curiosity in others, the telltale expressions that preceded poor decisions. He had been cultivating opportunities, leaving subtle trails that might lure the right kind of victim to his sanctuary. When Timothy appeared in the doorway silhouetted against the gray October sky, Edwin felt something that might have been joy in another child, but was something far darker in him. The boy's marble eyes seemed to glow with anticipation as he watched Timothy hesitate at the threshold, torn between fear and curiosity. Edwin had learned that this moment of hesitation was crucial. It was when potential victims made the choice that would seal their fate. Edwin had lured Timothy inside with promises of helping find the lost bird, his voice taking on the sweet, innocent tone he had perfected through countless hours of practice. But instead of assistance, the younger boy found something far more sinister waiting in the shadows. Edwin's marble eyes had gleamed with anticipation as he showed Timothy his special collection, an assortment of bones, feathers, and other remnants from his previous experiments with living creatures. Timothy's reaction had been exactly what Edwin had hoped for, a mixture of fascination and revulsion that made the boy easy to manipulate. Edwin began what he called his teaching sessions, explaining to Timothy the various ways that living things could be made to stop living, demonstrating with small creatures he kept in makeshift cages throughout the mill. He spoke with the authority of a learned professor, his young voice taking on cadences that seemed borrowed from someone much older and infinitely more experienced in the mechanics of death. The details of Timothy's final moments were pieced together later from Edwin's own chilling confession, delivered with the same casual tone one might use to describe the weather. He spoke of Timothy's eyes, how they had changed from confusion to fear to something beyond terror as the true nature of the situation became clear. He described the sounds the boy had made, not just the obvious screams and pleas, but the subtler noises, the way his breathing changed, the small whimpers that escaped when he thought Edwin wasn't listening, the precise moment when his voice broke entirely. Edwin had been particularly fascinated by Timothy's attempts to negotiate, the way the younger boy had tried to bargain for his life with promises of secrecy, offers of friendship, even desperate attempts to convince Edwin that killing him would bring unwanted attention. These negotiations had provided Edwin with valuable insights into human psychology, revealing the various stages of acceptance that people experienced when confronted with their own mortality. The actual method of Timothy's death remained Edwin's secret, something he revealed only in fragments during different interrogations as if he were parceling out details like precious gifts. What was clear was that the process had been prolonged and methodical, designed more for Edwin's education than for any practical purpose. Timothy had become an unwilling participant in a comprehensive study of human suffering, his young body serving as both subject and laboratory for Edwin's dark curiosity. Edwin had hidden Timothy's body with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else, treating the disposal as another experiment in logistics and concealment. The boy was found 3 days later, buried beneath a carefully arranged pile of autumn leaves in a secluded corner of the mill property. But it was the condition of the body that truly terrified the townspeople. Timothy had been arranged in a pose that suggested he was simply sleeping, his hands folded peacefully across his chest, his face wearing an expression of unnatural serenity. More disturbing still were the signs that Edwin had continued to visit the burial site, bringing fresh flowers and even small toys as if maintaining a shrine to his victim. The positioning of these offerings suggested that Edwin viewed Timothy not as a person he had killed, but as a possession he had acquired, something that continued to belong to him even in death. The marble-eyed boy had crossed the threshold from menace to murderer, and he had done so with a calm deliberation that defied his young age. There had been no passion in the act, no sudden rage or loss of control. Timothy's death had been planned, executed, and memorialized with the same careful attention Edwin might have given to a school project. When confronted with the evidence, Edwin showed no remorse, no fear, no emotion whatsoever. He simply nodded when asked if he had killed Timothy Walsh, as if confirming a weather forecast or acknowledging a mathematical equation. His only concern seemed to be whether the investigators had properly appreciated the artistry of his work, the careful consideration he had given to every detail of the crime. His parents' desperate attempts to conceal the horror came too late. The entire town had already learned the truth about what lived behind those marble eyes. Jeremiah Grayson's faith finally shattered completely that terrible October night, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling under the weight of what his son had become. Margaret stopped speaking altogether, communicating only through gestures and the occasional written note, as if words themselves had become too dangerous to trust. Sarah and Thomas were sent away to live with distant relatives, their childhood innocence forever scarred by the knowledge of what their brother had become. But even distance could not protect them from the nightmares, the constant fear that Edwin's influence might somehow reach across the miles to reclaim them as subjects for his next experiment. The community that had once been merely uncomfortable with Edwin Grayson's presence now lived in a state of pure terror that permeated every aspect of daily life. The murder of Timothy Walsh had shattered whatever illusions remained about the nature of the marble-eyed boy, transforming him from a disturbing oddity into an active threat that could strike at any moment. Children were forbidden from playing outdoors without adult supervision, their laughter and games replaced by hushed whispers and furtive glances over shoulders. Doors that had never known locks were suddenly barricaded each night, with families investing their savings in heavy bolts and reinforced hinges. Hardware stores reported unprecedented demand for security measures, with some residents going so far as to board up windows and install multiple layers of protection. The local church saw attendance triple as families sought divine protection from the evil that walked among them, in the form of a 9-year-old boy, their prayers taking on a desperate urgency that echoed through the sanctuary like collective keening. Fear spread through the town like a contagion, infecting every aspect of daily life with a paranoia that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Shopkeepers would close their businesses early, rather than risk an encounter with the marble-eyed child, their hands trembling as they counted the day's receipts and prepared for another sleepless night. The town's physician began prescribing sleeping drafts to half the population, as nightmares plagued both young and old. But even chemical oblivion provided little respite from the terror that had taken root in their collective consciousness. The local school closed indefinitely after parents refused to send their children to any building that Edwin might enter. Mrs. Whitmore had already fled to stay with relatives in a distant city, but her departure only seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears about the impossibility of coexisting with whatever Edwin represented. Even the bravest men in the community found themselves crossing to the other side of the street when they spotted Edwin's distinctive silhouette in the distance, their masculine pride crumbling under the weight of instinctual terror. The town's social fabric began to unravel as neighbors turned suspicious eyes on one another, wondering who might be harboring secret sympathies for the Grayson family or, worse still, who might be somehow complicit in Edwin's crimes. Longtime friendships dissolved overnight as people withdrew into their homes, trusting no one and venturing out only when absolutely necessary. The weekly market that had once been the heart of community life dwindled to a handful of desperate transactions conducted in broad daylight, with multiple witnesses present. The local sheriff, a man who had faced down armed outlaws and drunk cowboys, without flinching, admitted privately that he had never encountered anything that unnerved him as much as looking into Edwin Grayson's marble eyes. There was an intelligence there that seemed ancient, malevolent, and utterly without conscience, like staring into an abyss that stared back with calculating interest and infinite patience. The sheriff had dealt with killers before, men driven by greed or passion or desperation. But Edwin was something entirely different. The law seemed inadequate when dealing with a child who showed no remorse, no fear of punishment, no recognition that he had done anything wrong. How do you prosecute someone who genuinely doesn't understand the concept of guilt? How do you rehabilitate someone who views human suffering as an interesting experiment rather than a moral failing? These questions haunted the sheriff's dreams and left him feeling helpless in the face of an evil that seemed to transcend conventional understanding. Theories about Edwin's nature spread like wildfire through the frightened community, each explanation more fantastic than the last. The more religious residents claimed he was possessed by demons, pointing to his unnatural behavior and the atmosphere of dread that followed him wherever he went. They organized prayer circles and cleansing rituals, burning sage and holy water in elaborate ceremonies designed to ward off whatever dark forces had taken residence in the boy's soul. Others whispered that he had been born without a soul, a hollow vessel filled with nothing but hunger for suffering and death. This theory gained particular traction among those who had witnessed Edwin's complete lack of emotional response to his crimes. It was easier to believe that he was missing some essential human component than to accept that such evil could exist within the normal spectrum of human nature. Dr. Morrison, The town's only educated man of science suggested that Edwin might be suffering from a rare form of moral insanity, a condition he had read about in medical journals from back east. But even he admitted that Edwin's case went far beyond anything described in the literature, displaying not just an absence of moral feeling, but an active delight in causing pain that seemed to transcend normal human psychology. The doctor had requested consultations with specialists in larger cities, but none were willing to travel to examine a child who had already demonstrated his capacity for violence. The atmosphere grew so heavy with paranoia and dread that families who had lived in the town for generations began packing their belongings and moving away, abandoning homes and businesses that had been in their families for decades. Property values plummeted as word spread to neighboring communities about the cursed town and its marble-eyed monster, creating an economic disaster that compounded the social and psychological trauma already plaguing the residents. The local newspaper stopped printing altogether after the editor received death threats for refusing to publish an article calling for Edwin's immediate execution. The threats had come not from Edwin's supporters, he had none, but from residents who believed that any publicity might attract unwanted attention from outside authorities who might not understand the unique nature of their situation. They preferred to handle the problem internally, even if they had no clear plan for how to do so. Mail delivery became sporadic as postal workers reported feeling watched whenever they approached certain areas of town, particularly anywhere near the Grayson property. Telegraph lines were cut repeatedly by unknown vandals, isolating the community from the outside world and creating a siege mentality that only intensified the existing paranoia. Some residents began to suspect that Edwin was somehow orchestrating these disruptions, though he was never seen near any of the incidents. As winter approached, the town settled into an uneasy routine of avoidance and prayer, but everyone knew that this fragile equilibrium could not last forever. Edwin Grayson was growing older, stronger, and more dangerous with each passing day, his experiments becoming more sophisticated, and his understanding of human psychology more refined. The question that haunted every resident was not if he would kill again, but when, and who would be next to face those terrible marble eyes in their final moments. Children who had once played freely in the streets now moved in groups, their games replaced by constant vigilance and whispered warnings about avoiding certain areas of town. Parents began teaching their children elaborate codes and signals, ways to communicate danger without alerting potential threats to their awareness. The innocence of childhood had been sacrificed on the altar of survival, creating a generation that would never know the simple joy of carefree play. The town's religious leaders struggled to provide comfort and guidance in the face of evil that seemed to challenge their most fundamental beliefs about the nature of humanity and divine justice. How could a loving God allow such darkness to take root in the heart of a child? What purpose could such suffering possibly serve in any grand divine plan? These questions fractured congregations and left many questioning not just their faith, but their understanding of the very nature of good and evil. Yet through it all, Edwin continued his daily routines with the same calm deliberation that had marked his entire short life, seemingly unaware of or indifferent to the chaos his presence had created. He walked the streets with those marble eyes scanning constantly, always watching, always learning, always preparing for whatever dark experiment would next capture his interest. Picture a small town in Illinois, 1812, where the world felt untouched by time. Willow Creek was a scattering of log cabins and dirt paths, cradled by dense woods that seemed to swallow the sunlight. The air carried the scent of damp moss and chimney smoke, life moving to the rhythm of creaking wagon wheels and distant church bells. Families toiled under open skies, their children chasing fireflies as dusk painted the horizon red. But one crisp autumn morning, a shadow crept into this quiet place. A new family, the Graysons, arrived without fanfare, their wagon rattling down the rutted road. They spoke of building a schoolhouse, a gift to the town, a place to shape young minds with knowledge and faith. The townsfolk, hungry for progress, welcomed the idea. Education was a rare jewel on the frontier, and the promise of a school felt like a blessing. Yet as the wooden structure rose deep in the woods, far from the town's heart, unease began to stir. The schoolhouse stood alone, its weathered planks looking older than they should, as if the forest itself had birthed it. No children's laughter spilled from its windows. No games of tag filled its yard. Instead, a heavy silence draped the place, thick as fog, broken only by the groan of locked doors or the rustle of leaves skittering across the ground. The townsfolk noticed other oddities. The Graysons kept to themselves, their faces stern, their eyes sharp as flint. Elijah Grayson, the patriarch, was a towering figure with a voice like thunder, quoting scripture to anyone who lingered too long. His family, wife and grown children, moved with a strange precision, their smiles tight, their gazes cold. Parents dropped their children at the school each morning, watching them vanish behind those heavy doors. The little ones returned quieter than before, their chatter replaced by glances over their shoulders as if something unseen followed them home. Neighbors whispered over fences, their voices low. "It's too quiet," one said, staring at the path to the woods. "No school should be that still." Another spoke of hearing strange chants at night, drifting from the trees like a hymn gone wrong. The townsfolk tried to shrug it off. After all, the Graysons were godly people, weren't they? They attended church, shared their harvest, and spoke of saving souls. But doubts gnawed at their trust. A farmer passing by at dusk swore he saw a flicker of light in the school's windows long after lessons should have ended. A hunter claimed the wolves avoided that stretch of forest, their howls falling silent near the school's clearing. Children began to speak in hushed tones of rules they couldn't explain, their small hands trembling as they clutched their slates. One mother noticed her son's shoes, caked with mud that smelled of decay, though the schoolyard was dry. Questions piled up unanswered. Why were the doors always locked? Why did the Graysons watch the town with such piercing stares as if guarding a secret no one dared to name? Parents hesitated at the school's threshold, their hearts heavy with a fear they couldn't voice. Willow Creek was a town built on faith and community, but something about that schoolhouse felt wrong, like a stain spreading across a clean cloth. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the truth began to claw its way to the surface, hinting at a darkness far worse than anyone could imagine. That darkness had a name: the Graysons. To the people of Willow Creek, they were a family, a virtue, their lives a mirror of frontier piety. Elijah Grayson stood at the center, a man whose presence filled a room like smoke. His beard was tangled as briars, his voice a deep rumble that could silence a crowd with a single verse from Leviticus. His wife Abigail was a vision of restraint, her apron crisp, her eyes always downcast, as if hiding a storm within. Their 3 grown children, Harlan and Silas, broad-shouldered brothers with hands calloused from work, and Eliza, a wisp of a girl with raven hair, completed the picture of a devout clan. They greeted neighbors with nods, donated apples to the poor, and knelt in the front pew every Sunday. But behind the walls of their log cabin nestled beside the schoolhouse, the mask slipped. The Grayson home was no sanctuary. It was a crucible where cruelty was forged in secret. Elijah ruled with a ferocity that left no room for defiance. His discipline wasn't just strict, it was brutal. A spilled glass at dinner could earn a lash from his belt, the leather snapping like a whip. Abigail, so gentle in public, enforced his will with a quieter venom. She'd lock the children in their rooms for hours, whispering through the door about sin and shame until their sobs grew faint. Harlan and Silas, now in their 20s, had learned their father's ways too well. They turned sibling spats into violent contests, pinning each other down in the dirt behind the house, their laughter edged with malice. Eliza, the youngest at 19, was different, silent, watchful, her eyes like dark pools reflecting the family's sins. She moved through the house like a ghost, obeying without question, her hands trembling as she served meals. The family's evenings were tense, the air thick with unspoken rules. A wrong glance could shatter the silence, plates crashing against walls, shouts muffled to avoid prying ears. Neighbors never heard the chaos, only saw the Graysons' polished exterior. The next morning, yet cracks in that facade began to show. A townsman delivering firewood caught a glimpse through a window. Abigail's face twisted in anger, her hand raised over Eliza. A child's slate, dropped in the schoolyard, bore strange markings, not lessons, but symbols scratched in fear. The family's piety, once a shield, started to feel like a performance. Elijah's sermons grew harsher, warning of divine wrath for those who questioned authority. Abigail's charity came with strings, her gifts paired with pointed reminders of loyalty. Harlan and Silas began lingering in town, their presence looming like storm clouds, silencing gossip with a glance. The schoolhouse, their domain, became an extension of this control. What happened within its walls wasn't education. It was something far darker, a twisted reflection of the family's own warped dynamic. The children who entered each morning weren't just students. They were pawns in a game only the Graysons understood. As winter loomed, the town's unease deepened, whispers growing louder about what lay beneath the family's holy veneer. The school, meant to enlighten, was becoming a place where innocence went to die.